Well, I'm really disappointed that Terry couldn't come tonight, and unfortunately she's sick too. I mean, that's the only reason I came tonight. I want to hear Terry. I want to hear Terry's story. The sequence on this, teeny bit of a history. The Wild Basin Committee, you all know about them, and then I showed up one point, and I don't know what I volunteered for. It was something minor, and I had been doing a lot with summer camps and kids and things like that, so I volunteered to do a little bit more, and eventually I became too useful to go away. And then they hired me as the first part-time executive director, and then to do the education program with me, I hired Judy Walther and I, who had done a lot of work together with kids and all that, and then we did the education program, mostly her with me doing it for 7 or 8 years, and pretty soon in there we needed somebody to help do trails, because there was no trails in here, and we hired Terry Siegenthal at that point. She was there for about 7 years. So Judy and Terry and I were kind of the original 3 staff people. We were all on part-time, and we were working 50, 60 hours a week, and trying to just get by, and no dental insurance, things like that. But we did a big program, and there was no building, and at first, the road wasn't there, but that came, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how it came. First question, how many people live downstream on Bee Creek?
Close.
Okay, so slide 1. Whoop. Let's go back to slide 2, 3, 4. I want that one. Okay. This is Loop 360. So they started to build that highway, and it was the Texas Highway Department, and they didn't do a very good job. And they were planting exotic grasses like Bermuda grass on the side of the road, and they had these steep slopes. And we started to get gullies. This is like behind me on the camera, probably is where those big culverts are that come under the road in the main valley. And I have another, I don't know if that's Esther, I don't know. I have another picture of Esther when those gullies were about this wide and about this deep. And they kept getting bigger, and the Wild Basin Committee was complaining to the Highway Department. And so we were starting to measure, good science. So we were doing this with kids. We'd take 5th grade kids out, and we would stretch a string across or tape measure, and then they would measure down and they would make a cross section, math in the park, right? And they would have the cross section. And so we had this series of cross sections, and this gully was about, 2, 3, 4 feet wide, about a foot deep, and it got bigger and got bigger and got bigger. And then, this is, okay, so all the stuff that's missing there, where did it go? It went down to Max's house, it went down the creek, that's where it went. All right, so let's look at the next slide. So, wait, not yet. So the Highway Department, so Janet Pogue went to the Highway Department, the first meeting of Deadman, was his name, it was his first meeting. She wouldn't let me go, I looked too much like a hippie. So the little old ladies with tennis shoes went down to the Highway Department and went, and they were going to present. And so they presented these pictures, and they started out with the little gullies, and the Highway Department people said, oh, that's not very good. And then they got bigger, and then they got pictures of these 5th graders measuring the engineering skills of the Highway Department doing cross-section. And we showed them this picture, okay? And so Deadman said, well, you rained on my parade here. It was his first meeting. And so they set up a committee. So let's go to the next slide. That's the committee of the Highway Department. That's 360 up on top. And they're all coming down there to look at that thing. And they had Raymond Slade, the hydrologist, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, we had some kids around to watch them, to see how engineers work. It was kind of like a learning experience. So there's the Highway Department and the engineers. Notice, I mean, this is 1981. Look at the fashions.
The bells are backwards to die for.
Yeah, and then, so they were going to do something. So then, next slide. These are the first gabions that the highway department ever used in the state of Texas. And it was because, we put the heat on them, and we put the heat on, like, the Wild Basin Committee didn't do a sit-in, but we said, okay, and if you don't come out here, well, that's okay. We're going to keep these fifth graders coming back here, measuring these gullies, and we'll send you some more next year, right? So, and then go back to that first picture. Where'd the sediment go? That's where it went. Now, you may know this waterfall. This is the main waterfall that's off of 360. It's down about 100 yards. And this area here was where there was a pool of about 5 or 6 feet deep of water. And that's about 5 or 6 feet deep. You notice the size of the boulders, too. There's this. Also, all of that was scouring off the travertine on the ferns and all that. So, where did that go? That went downstream, of course. It's still going downstream. I'm sure it's only been 3 or 4 years since that photo. Some of it's on the banks, in the woods, it's still moving. Now, who was downstream from Wild Basin on Bee Creek? Poor highway department. The first 3 people were 3 lawyers. Including John Scanlon and I can't remember.
Scanlon's the only one I know.
Yeah, maybe I'll remember. It doesn't matter. So they got involved, of course, because this sediment was in their little crystal clear pools that they used to have were filled with sediment, and it was in West Hollow, and so the highway department decided not to do it, and so they got backhoes and stuff, and they hauled a bunch of dirt out in several places, in some of the lawyers' ponds. They had to clean them out, and the pond where North Hollow meets the trail on the old Wild Basin Ledge Road going down the valley, that big area there, they scooped out dozens of truckloads. So that was early on, and we kept talking to the highway department. They needed to use native seed on the roadsides, Bermuda grass, and sandy loam. Slopes like this, sandy loam and Bermuda grass. And they thought we were a bunch of radical crackpots, environmentalists, telling them that was a mistake, that they should use little blue stem and things like that. So that was one of the important battles that we had to do to get that going. So maybe I'll end with that for my first story and see what else you want to hear.
Well, that's great. I thought I had heard most of the origin stories, and I knew about a paragraph of this, so you really expanded my.
Well, I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds of Ektachrome photos with one of those little cameras of all those ditches, the gullies up and down both sides of the road and North Hollow. Yeah.
David, can I ask a quick question? How was it that you were interested in native plants as opposed to any other? I mean, what got you going down that road? Because when you went down that road, that was early.
How much do you want to do this stuff in the middle or whatever?
This is just a fun social time.
I'll be real quick. As a kid, I wasn't really interested in plants. I was in New Jersey. I was interested in turtles and snakes and worms to feed my box turtles and cocoons or whatever other stuff I could find in New Jersey. And then I came to Texas, but I learned a lot of botany, because when I went back years later, I wandered around those woods. I knew that I knew those plants, not by name, but by eye. My eye knew those plants, even though I didn't hardly know any names or any botany when I was a kid. But I just spent a lot of time in the woods. And then when I had my first son, I would take him out to Colorado. We'd get on one of those big trails where, as a young man, I would be used to getting my day pack, and I'd go up 4 or 5 miles and I'd see some neat things. I'd come back, and then with a little kid, you get about 50 yards in a half hour, and you slow down. And that's when I started to do more botany. But mostly it was being at Wild Basin. Because when I got to Wild Basin, there was a report by John Williams. He was with the Natural Areas Survey. It was a little branch of the state government, and they had to do little reports for land and whatever. And John Williams had a great collection. He had a good species list. It was the first species in my life that I walked around with. I'd done a little bit before. I had Button's Cob Fern book for Eastern United States, which is a beautiful book. And I would use that as a camp counselor because in addition to catching salamanders, I would press ferns or leaves with the kids. But it was coming here and getting an official species list and saying, what are these? And at that point, I could call on people like Steve Musos, who was the director of botany at ACC. I could call upon one of the best botanists in Texas for identifying plants, which was Marshall Johnson, who was teaching courses, and he would come in. He was the one that would identify. Judy Walther and I would scratch our heads, and because there was no picture books. The only book was Carell and Johnson. You know, it's this big. It has all the plants, and there's no pictures in it, right? Not the best place for a beginner, but there was none of this online web. Let's see what this is. Oh God! This was like walking to high school in the snow for 6 miles, you know, identifying plants with Carell and Johnson. And then the other gem was Brother Daniel Lynch. And so those were the three botanists. And it wasn't later on that Bill came, but by that time I knew those other three greats. And now I rely on Bill, because, but maybe I'll tell some Brother Daniel Lynch stories before the night's over.
Very good.
My turn?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dave. That was very informative. Now, my memory is not what it used to be. So while I'm speaking, if I start going like this, that means I'm trying to pluck a thought or a name out of the air. And if you get an edge on what I'm looking for, speak out, okay? All right. Let's see. I first came into Wild Basin before it was, before the preserve effort began. I met one of the neighbors who lives on the other side, and Paul Piercy. And he took me down in here one night, and I recognized its beauty instantly, but didn't see a lot, of course, because it was at night. And then a few years later, I moved to Taos, New Mexico for 5 years. And then I had a serious injury, and I had to come back here to recuperate. And finally, I was able to start hiking again. And so I saw a blurb in the paper for an interpretive tour at Wild Basin. I didn't even know it was a preserve at that time. So I signed up immediately, and it was that weekend. And I had my bachelor's degree is in biology, and I had already worked as a wilderness guide, and so I thought, I can do this. So I signed up for their training, and that was about a month every weekend. Bob Warnicke was one of the instructors, and so finished that and started immediately giving 2 tours every weekend for like a year. And so I got to know the staff here and other people. And then the fellow who was living here as the on-site caretaker, Bill Brooks, decided to leave. And so the staff knew me by then, and they asked me if I wanted to take the job. And I said, you know, live on nearly 300 acres of wild land. Gee, I don't know about that. I think I took 5 seconds to make up my mind. And so I did. I was here for 10 years, from 2000 to 2010. And it's one of the peak experiences of my life, not only because it's a wonderful place to live, but because my success was due to the fact that I had immediately had tremendous resources, like Terry Siegenthaler and Rose Farmer, and after a while, Bill Carr, and Dave. Dave helped me too. Other people too, dozens and dozens of people. For example, after I've been here a couple of years, I saw this white material that it was at the base of a lot of trees one day. And I thought, what in the world is that? And somehow I figured out that it was slime mold, which I'd never seen before. I just knew it was a fungus and that was about it. So I called a friend of mine who was on the biology faculty at UT and asked her if she knew anybody who specialized in this sort of thing, and she did. She gave me his number. I called the guy immediately, described what I was seeing, and I said, I need somebody to come out here and educate me. And he said, well, I think my wife and I could be out there probably in a couple hours. Okay. So they came out, and he was really excited because he had rarely seen so many at one time. The weather had been just exactly right and so forth. Anyway, that's an example of the kind of assistance I had. And we had a lot of volunteers. At that time, most of them were community service restitution people from the county. They were working off their debt to the county because they had traffic fines or something like that. They were not all nonviolent. After a while, if people were here more than, say, 3 or 4 weekends, their time would be up, and they'd ask one of us, well, can I keep coming out here? Sure. So I had wonderful volunteers because they wanted to be here. And a couple of them are still really close friends. I would love to see some of the others too, but these two particular became really good friends. Let's see, what have I got here? And Rose Farmer, well, when Terry left here, eventually she was hired as the manager of the Natural Resources Department, I think it's called, of the county. And she held that position for what, 5 or 6 years? Do you remember?
I'm not sure.
It
was when the county got Hamilton Pool.
When the county what?
Got Hamilton Pool. That was
right. Okay.
That was why she went with the county.
Well, when she decided it was time to leave there, Rose Farmer succeeded her, and Rose was in that position the entire time I was here, and I got along great with both of them, and they introduced me to almost everybody in the environmental community here. So I had this list of people to call a mile long, and I remember Rose, we liked, we got along well the first time we met, but after about 2 years, and I would call, if I needed some expertise, I would call or explain the problem, and she usually didn't have time. She would send one of her wildlife biologists here to help me, advise me. And after 2 or 3 years, I remember one day I called her, and she said, Mike, I trust you. You don't need to call me anymore. You know all my biologists, just call one of them directly at the field station out near 620. And so I did, and that worked out really, really well. So anyway, let's see. I made friends with a fella in the city of Westlake Hills government, and I don't remember his name now, but he was sort of like a land manager, and I told him that one of the problems we had was that, we've got billions of junipers here, which when we use juniper primarily for the erosion bars in the trail. But we don't like to cut our juniper. We don't want to cut any more than we have to, but we do when we need to. And I'm trying to find a source. And he said, I have your problem solved. One day he took me out. We drove around in Westlake Hills to construction sites where houses were being built. And he introduced me to the project manager or the contractor who was on site, and I explained the problem. And they said, yeah, we have to clear juniper fairly regularly for the footprint of the house. And I said, well, if you can cut them to this specification, I think it was like 8 feet and a minimum of 6 inches in diameter. And they did, and they would call me when they had a stockpile. And we'd get a truck and go over there and collect them and bring them back here and put them in our stockpile. Things like that. Like Dave, I could go on forever about this, but I'll stop there.
Well, is there another story that y'all would like to share?
Well, I'd be interested if anybody in the audience has things about Wild Basin they want to tell us about, keeping it to Wild Basin if you could.
I can do a fairly short one. I'm Mark Varner. I was director of Wild Basin right after David. And just a little background, I went to the University of Texas, botanist by training, taxonomist. I got my PhD with Billy Turner, and I did my first native plants class with Marshall Johnson. We actually came out here for one of our field trips. Now, this is like 1966 or so there's nothing out here at that time. So just a little background. Then after I got my PhD, I was at the University of Tennessee for 9 years. And then in a strange twist of fate, I ended up in my family's manufacturing business for a couple of years. And then I was searching around for different type. Then I was at St. Jude Children's Hospital for a couple of years. And then I was in between, I was an editor, scientific editor. Okay. So I was working on grant proposals and manuscripts. And then I was between jobs. And I was down here, I was divorced, but my ex-wife and my son were living here, and I was up in Dallas. And so I was in here one time, and staying with a friend, looking at the newspaper at the want ads, and they're advertising for director of Wild Basin. If it hadn't been for that particular visit, I would have never been director of Wild Basin, and the whole trajectory of my life would have been different. So I sent in my stuff, and then I was invited to interview. And part of that, and this is the quick and end of the story really, was I was to go over to Janet Pogue's home to visit with her. And so this is my introduction to the whole Wild Basin thing. And I walk up to the front door, and there's this dog there in the front. And I kind of go, oh, hi, dog. And the next thing I know, it bites me. And so Janet comes out, and I look at her and said, your dog just bit me. And she said, oh yeah, she's kind of old and cranky. I'm wondering, what have I gotten myself to here? But then I got to meet Judy and David and Terry and other people who were here, and it was a good time. But that's the only story that I want to tell is my strange beginning here with Janet dog biting me.
You had a story.
I don't have a story, I have a question to all of you who've been here for a while. The dump. What can you tell us about the dump?
You know.
Tell us about what?
The dump.
Oh, the dump.
That was here at Wild Basin, and how did it disappear?
The dump, which is basically primarily downhill from the parking area, and it came to the gully that's kind of at the end where the restroom is and so on. That was an unofficial dump that people would go down, of course, way before Loop 360 was there, and they would drive through some of the way you got to St. Stephen's is you you would go on Bee Caves Road, you would go past where Loop 360 is, and you go down another half a mile, and then you would go on that road on a ridge that goes all the way and dead ends at St. Stephen's. You couldn't come, there was of course no bridge across the river, so it was way down. And so people would come in those back roads, and they would get here, and they would throw stuff out the back, and every now and then they would burn it. And so, some of that came from just anybody driving around the road, but some of it came from the city semi-officially dumping stuff here, or people that worked for the cities, a contractor for the cities, or whatever. So the city had a little bit of dirty fingers in that thing. And what was happening is that the gullies, so the whole hillside was deep burned glass. And it was all broken glass. It was 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 feet deep. And it was eroding, and that glass would then go into North Hollow, and it would go down, heading down to all the lawyers. So what we did is we felt that we needed to stabilize that, and so we developed a plan, and what we did is we got caliche, trucks of caliche that were donated, and we got them. We looked at the possibility, like getting that hauled out. It was a huge amount of material. Hauling it out and causing that big of a scar would have been really difficult. So a decision made, the most practical and maybe the most environmental thing, was to just cap it. Because it had been burned, and so a lot of any of that was toxic. Just we were breathing in the air, but it wasn't sitting there so much in the water, perhaps. Although there was rust that comes out. So then we capped it with a couple feet of caliche with backhoes, not the whole thing, like closer to the road, there's basically 75 years of cedar needles and dirt on top. If you dug down a little bit, it would be just glass and broke itself. But this part where it was eroded, we took that area and we capped it with a bunch of caliche, and then we did my first major rockwork project. We'd take these big boulders and we'd make sort of contours and brush berms, and we stabilized it, and we seeded it all with native grasses and all that, almost none of which was commercially available. At that point, you could maybe buy side oats grama and maybe buffalo grass. You couldn't really buy little blue stem even. Now there's seed company, you can get stuff. Couldn't get it, so we took Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and volunteers, and we'd strip little blue stem and all that, and we planted that, and then the city paid for a little bit because they felt a little guilty, and then they gave Wild Basin a small grant so that we wrote the process of habitat restoration in the Upper Glen Rose limestone, and it was dated in the mid-80s. And we talked about how what we were trying to do was we were putting back the native plant community and all that. We didn't really believe this, but we kind of invented habitat restoration. Because it wasn't like somebody told us to do habitat restoration. We said the obvious thing to do was to put the plants that are native, that we know are here, that grow on this caliche, those are the ones we want to use. And we didn't have the words for habitat restoration. And so we published this 40-page book, but there's some in the office here somewhere, right? And if you read it, it's still pretty good. It's still the basic principles of getting the shape right and trying real diversity of species and all that didn't have any connection to anybody else. And then the coda to that story is soon after, in maybe the second edition of, we'll see who's paying attention here. How many people know what the Whole Earth catalog was? All right, so the Whole Earth catalog came out, and they would connect things. They would have little articles about stuff. And they said, well, there was this little article, and it was, a little couple paragraphs that Bill Jordan up at the University of Wisconsin is having a little gathering, and he started Restoration and Management Notes. And it's going to come out of Wisconsin, and issue 1, volume 1 came out, and Bill Jordan put that out. And that was before the Society of Ecological Restoration had begun. It was before I knew what the word restoration really meant. But what was happening, sorry about that. What was happening, and it was similar with the women's liberation movement and the black liberation movement, is that individually, people independently were coming to the same sort of conclusion, that we just had to know how to put things back. And so that connection, me having done this, and then going out to California and meeting some people out there, and there was very little happening here. But the centers were in Wisconsin and the Midwest, where they were starting to do tallgrass prairie restoration. Some of the wetland people along the East Coast around the Delaware River and Bay, and then some of the California people and the West Coast people were starting to do restoration. The California Highway Department was demanding coastal scrub restoration and all that. And so Bill Jordan, with his publication, pulled people like me who were sort of isolated with the people who were isolated in Minnesota and the people that were isolated doing pine barren stuff, and they got us together. And so we were at the very early stages, because the science of habitat restoration is only about as old as that. You know, the science of restoration there's a few people like around 1900 that had some ideas that were similar, and there was some people in the Alps in the 1890s that had some articles about putting back the native trees in the Alps or stuff like that. But restoration as a concept did not really exist in human society, because there was always too much of that stuff. And somewhere around towards the end of that century, people started to realize that's not enough. And we need to do the reverse process. So this project was extreme. This was maybe the third restoration attempt in Texas. And the other one was David Riskin did a little acre of grass restoration over at the front of the headquarters, and then the Burlesons, they were a couple of years before, and they did the Burleson Prairies. And then there was this right there. That's the third oldest restoration in the state of Texas, as far as anybody knows.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So I'm way at the late end of any of this stuff about ecology and restoring environments and so forth. And I was a little curious, working over at across where Joe O'Donnell is there, Bureau Preserve. He talks about the history of the place and the denuding of the area by the choppers and then the fires and all that kind of stuff. So what kind of condition was this in when it became a wild preserve? And what was your take at that point? Obviously, you were not doing restoration, but did you have any thoughts about that kind of stuff at that point?
Let me start with a couple. I got lucky. This was a huge gift. Wild Basin Preserve has one of the very, very best remnants of hill country habitat in the world. There's a few other places that have, in the hill country, that have this grasslands that are this undisturbed. They're not completely undisturbed. I mean, we had a dump, for God's sake, here. But relatively speaking, most of the hill country has been totally chewed over. And cows and horses. Now, there's a very interesting historical thing, that Wild Basin, when the Wild Basin Committee and Janet Bogan and all those people put this together, they were mostly getting 5 and 10 and 15 acre pieces. And that had been divided up because, as I understand it, when you bought a house on the north part of campus, one of those developments, you got a house, and along with the deed to that house, you got a woodlot in Westlake Hills, because the lake wasn't there, and you're going to take a wagon over to get your firewood. So what happens is this was all chopped up, and you can't fence 10 acres and put a cow on it. You can't put a horse on it, right? And so this is all divided into little pieces, and nobody ever put it together enough to get the animals really on it. And so that was the first stroke of luck. And then the second thing that happened is, I think the stars knew that I was gonna come and be interested in this, but about 30 years before I got here, a great experiment was set up. Half the Wild Basin burned to the ground. Mostly like from here, that whole valley over there. No, mostly this, I'm sorry, this valley over here, not this valley.
It
And
was
so-
1961, right?
61, yeah. And so this was this incredible setup that I was given. Take, like, if you were scientists trying to study this, say, okay, let's take this thing and let's completely torch half of it and leave the other half and then watch it for 20 years and 30 and 40 years and see what happens. And it was stunning piece of paying attention. Like, you go to North Hollow, and of course you had the diversity, because you still had the sumacs and the silk tassels and the red buds, and they hadn't been eaten out by cows and goats and all that. And you would go over there and you would see this clump of them, right? And you would look at the clump and there'd be a stump of a cedar tree that was burned, it was all blackened, and right to that period, and there was this big ring of these shrubs. And you know, you can still find it, those stumps are still probably there. Whereas over here, you go over here, and there isn't that, and you see these bigger cedar trees, and you go underneath, because the cows and the goats and all that haven't eaten them, and there's all these little baby trees, and madrones, and evergreen sumacs, and little redbuds, and if they don't burn or get knocked over by wind, they'll kind of struggle. But once the fire comes through, it releases all of that, and the cedars don't resprout, and all of these things come up. And bingo, David says, that's the succession of the shrubby plant community in the hill country. You get these fires, there's this nursery, primarily under the cedar trees, a little under live oaks.
So you had a demonstration of fire.
And it demonstrates what kind of has long been interrupted. And the role that fire played, not just in because this was more of a savanna-y community, it wasn't real hardcore grassland, because there was that important shrub community. And it was related to, there are two important birds, the golden cheek warbler and black-capped vireo. So the golden cheek warbler, they lived over there. That's where you had the cedar trees that didn't burn, because there was always patches of cedar trees in the hill country that didn't burn, because you know the fire was coming across and it got to this valley, and then a hurricane came or something and stopped or whatever. So there was always big cedars, there was always some no cedars. And so that's where the golden cheeks were. What was over here, black-capped vireos. Black-capped vireos, it's too dense. They don't like that. They like a shrub community. They don't like it right after it's burned. And all the people that are working with the county can tell you this, that there's this sweet spot for black-capped vireos. And it lasts 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Nobody maybe knows exactly. But if you don't have a fire for a long time, the black-capped vireos start to disappear. And right after a fire, they're not there. But if the shrubs are there to come back, which they're not in places, there's no seed source. But if they come back, once they start coming back, that's where the vireos are. See? So I come in here, post-fire, 30, 40, 50 years. There's the vireos that, not John Williams, but the other guy, I can't remember his name. Anybody know who did that animal report?
You did what?
There was a botany report and there was an animal report. Well, whatever. He said, this is before they're endangered. Black-capped vireos, really rare bird, they're over there. And golden cheek warblers, but they're more common. The black-capped vireos are rarer. And it was, so, one point, another story. I'm trying not to take up too much time, but yeah. Jim O'Donnell comes as a volunteer, and he said, I'm kind of looking for something to do. He was volunteering in the middle of this, and I need a good project. I said, well, you know, it is mentioned that there's black-capped vireos, and we don't know anything about them. He said, black-capped vireos, I don't know anything about them. Right. Now he's one of the experts in the world on black-capped vireos, because he got here and he went over there and he kind of figured it out, and then they started being... Pardon?
Who was that?
Jim O'Donnell.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Jim O'Donnell, right? And so he's still working over there and black-capped vireo expert. And he was instrumental in a number of people that helped get the information about black-capped vireos that, first of all, helped get them listed, but then helped figure out that whole thing about fire and post-fire, and that, you know, the county may have some black cat vireo community, but if you don't do anything, it won't be there forever. And you need to clear some cedar, you know, you need to work with that succession, because to restore black cat vireo, you can't depend on natural forces. Black cat vireo are kind of dependent on people to make that succession happen and make sure that 10, 20, and 50 years from now, there's still some patches that are just right, the sweet spot. Long answer to the question, sorry.
That was perfect.
Well, kind of a really cool side note on that. This year on the Vireo Preserve right over here, they had the first black cat vireo nest that they monitored that site for the first time in 40 or 50 years. It just,
Yeah, I remember when I first heard about this concept of the sweet spot or the range in which they will nest and so forth. I was taken over there by some biologist and ornithologist. He was explaining all this to me. I said, well, how do you measure this? How do you judge it? He said, oh, it's about knee high to shoulder high. Okay, that's pretty close.
So here's another real quick little story. So one of the great botanists was Brother Daniel Lynch. So over here on this trail, when you go down there, you see these great Spanish oaks. And there's these trunks, and there's a hole in the middle. So we had a theory. These were Spanish oaks that are that were burned to the ground in that fire in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And then once an oak like that burns, you know, the stump goes away, and then you get little shoots coming up, and then you get a ring around the hole, and 4, 5, or 6 make them, and you get those clusters, right? That's how those are older than those trees. They're sprouts off the cluster that get burned, and who knows how many times that's happened in there.
Right, the multi-trunks of the Spanish oak indicate a previous fire.
Right. So Brother Daniel Lynch said, well, that's a great theory, but let's test it. So he brought out a tree core to do tree rings. So we get out there, and Jim O'Donnell was with us. We were right over I could take you to the tree. And we started coring those things, and first time we did it, we just broke the metal thing off. It's probably one of those trees. If you ever get a chainsaw and you hit some core at some scientist, that's Brother Daniel Lynch's fault. Or maybe mine, maybe I pulled on too hard. But then the second one we got, and sure enough, those tree rings dated right back to that fire. You know, oh, yeah, that's it. And so we had a theory, but then we had one piece of data. Well, we had 2 pieces of data. One was that those trees break off those tree cores, and the other was that, yeah, those sprouts go back to that fire. So your guess is good.
How many people here ever got to meet Brother Daniel Lynch from St. Ed's? Okay.
Quite a personality.
I can still remember the day I met him. He was giving a lecture down in that little, the building that is now the office at Barton Springs. And that's the same day I met Elizabeth McGreevy. How many people have been able to meet Elizabeth? You're fortunate people. Those are 2 of the most brilliant people I've ever met in terms of succession, restoration, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm grateful for that.
Here's a real quick story about Brother Daniel Lynch. Janet Pogue really wanted Lady Bird Johnson to get involved. You know, Janet Pogue trying to get this person involved and get this person's help, and you know, some of the money that came to the county was through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Cecil Andrus coming, and some money to the state parks to county, from county to buy the land, because the county bought the land, the Wild Basin Community didn't buy it. So Lady Bird Johnson, finally, Janet talks Lady Bird Johnson to come in and visit. So, of course, she couldn't come in on Loop 360, so Lady Bird Johnson comes in her limo all the way up to the end of the Wild Basin. We're down at the bottom of the park down there. And Janet had Brother Daniel Lynch, because he was very respectable as opposed to me. I just looked like a hippie still. So Brother Daniel Lynch is just a sweet gentleman. Yes. And so they pull over the car, and Lady Bird starts to get out, and Brother Daniel Lynch goes over and he holds the door. He holds the door. But the car was Wild Basin I drove, and the car's a little slow. I look over, and he's starting to turn red in the face. He's holding the door. Well, the door was a 400-pound door with lead in it. And so I think I ran over and helped him, or the Secret Service people helped him, and he was just about ready to drop the door on Lady Bird. Lady Bird was a great disappointment to Janet. She was very mad at Lady Bird because Lady Bird went on to start the Wildflower Center instead of supporting Janet at Wild Basin. So that's the end of that story. But poor Brother Daniel, I can still picture the look on his face when he knew he was about to drop the door on Lady Bird.
I remember when I learned that Brother Daniel had died in about 1993, and I had a part-time job, which took me over into the Capitol complex, and I was sitting there waiting to talk to some official about something, and there was an obit. I saw that, and I was together with Brother Daniel several times after that initial meeting, but I was so moved I had to leave the room. I started crying. He was such a special human being.
Very well. Any other wild stories in the audience? We're just crossed over the 7 o'clock hour.
Well, I have a wild question, which is living next to Wild Basin, I'm seeing succession continue. And I'm wondering if there's some way we can gain more insight into what's been before my time here, so that I get a sense of what's happening, because we don't have fire now, at least I hope not. Because if we do, my house will be toast. But how can we be aware of the successional process that's still continuing, and what the management practices are?
Well, I was kind of in charge of scratching my head about that question way back, and I'm not anymore. And I know that the people here have done some things like that. Since I left, there's fences up around it, there's different things that have happened, there's been some good invasive removal, but in some ways that's almost a question to ask the people who are running the park now. How to do that, how to get the equivalent of the fire. Now, I'll tell you one thing that was done is a number of years ago, probably about 10 years, maybe 15, at some point, it must have been the city, hired us to do some cedar clearing up near the Blacktop Bureaus up there to try to do with some manual clearing what fire would have done. But I haven't followed that. But there are things that can be done, but there's nothing like a good fire.
David, did they contract you? I'm sorry, I'm Barbara Dudley, the executive director of Wild Basin right now. Did they contract you to do that work within the preserve?
I think at that point, doesn't the city own the top of that hill? Yeah, I think it was on the city side of that property line, which the property line is kind of just before you kind of get flat up there as you go.
Right.
Well, we have raised the question with the county about measures we could take to ensure there's a mosaic across the landscape, because the mosaic is going away. The increase of woody vegetation across this, what was previously an open savanna, now 70 open savanna. So it's tough because neighbors don't want us to do a lot of heavy manipulation. I mean, the ideal would be fire, but we could do, mechanical manipulation to remove the woody vegetation. I think it would be beneficial to the preserve to restore the mosaic of habitat types.
But it seems like it's tending more and more to be a cedar woodland.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right. It would be a massive project, but I believe it's the only way.
Yeah.
A lot of chainsaw work. I remember, I guess maybe the first or second year when I was here, in the Vireo Preserve, which he's been describing next door where Jim O'Donnell works now, on that ridge, they finally decided, okay, we're going to have to manually take these plants down to the level where the vireo will come back in and nest. And they did a lot of cutting in there. And yes, they did come back, but the vegetation grew back so fast that in a few years, they were going to have to do it all over again. So that's why there's really no true substitute for fire in the landscape. But there are things that we can do.
The one thing that I'll add, and David kind of hit on this when he was talking on things, it's the $1 billion question that you asked for managers on this kind of. But what David suggested in his is that when this burned over here, the warblers went over here. But the problem that we have today is if this burns, there's nowhere for them to go because everything else has been developed and lost. So the question that we fight with today is if we do that manipulation and set stuff back, where do they go? Because they got nowhere to go because we are the only last bits left. So that's the $1 million.
So you're going to trade one species against another.
Exactly. It's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, humans.
I think the other piece of that that's really important is that Wild Basin doesn't have to be the whole ball of wax because the county and the city have more land, and so suppose it gets so that you lose black-cat vireo. Well, that would be sad, but not if there are places on the bigger tracts of land, on private ranches or other places that have the ability to do fire, that can do that, and that Wild Basin can have its niche within the larger community of all the protected lands, and they can be manipulated differently. So Wild Basin doesn't have to be manipulated to be all of the things that it was. It should be the best things that it was, and certainly there could be some manipulation involved, but it doesn't have to be all of them. Because especially if you think of it as connected and part of a more connected plan with the county lands, and they can do some burning and other experimental, and you're doing some chainsaw work up in your lands too. So, just make sure that it's not thought of as isolated from those, or some of the private land where there's more people on private lands that are doing some things that are sort of public in intent, or at least in terms of wildlife or habitat or plants and things like that. So that's really important to be connected in your thinking.
I have a geology question, because you're mostly botanists and you're focusing on the plant life and the wildlife. But one of my favorite parts as a docent, when I studied to be a docent in the early 2004, 5, 6, was the geology. It's so interesting when you're taking kids on a tour. I concentrate a lot on not the plants, but not their names, but the geology is how unique is it? I don't know. They used to joke about the UT geology students looking at the walls along the 360, right? That was down the road. What's happening with the geology now with all this mess to the north, where they're redoing the 360 and bridges and streets and whatever? Are people studying? Are they learning anything new in the layers of the roadsides? But I mean,
you're asking me to say something good about the highway department?
And then I guess comment on, I mean, how unique, because, you know, the Wildflower Center is similar in terms of native plants, but they don't have this really interesting geology that's here.
You're referring to the road cuts.
Well, and then what's happening here with the native plants.
Oh, by the way, this is Anita Knight. She's one of our long-term trail guides.
But we had a great geologist teaching about the geology, and he's gone, right? He was here 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Wayne Orlowski?
Yeah,
Yeah, he's in Colorado.
he's like going on.
Well, that was the other gift that I was given by working here, is because any geologist loves to be in Texas because you get everything from the coast to the igneous and everything in between. But Wild Basin has a really neat slice, and it has a teeny bit of the Edwards on the very cap of that ridge between here and BK Road. And then you've got the Walnut, and then you've got the Glenrose 5, 4, 3, I don't know if there's any 2, and 1. And so you've got, and they're different. And you can, and I made a lot of observations while I was working with madrones and things like that all limestone is not created equal, and the madrones are not randomly spread up and down that geology. They're a little fussy and blah, blah, blah. And so that's pretty interesting. So for 200 acres, there's some pretty neat geology, because you can stand on this porch and you can see that fossil bed that goes along the north hill that divides the Glenrose 5 from the Glenrose 4, and you can see what the Spanish oaks do in relationship to that geological break, and you can see it a little bit on this side when you go over there, but it's a little more cryptic because there's more big cedar trees. So the geology is really neat, and when you look over there at the Black Cat Vireo, at that point you're up into the walnut, and you get those big fossil beds of the walnut limestone that has a little different fossils than the fossil bed that runs around the valley here halfway down to the creek. That's the same one you see across. So it's a great place to walk around for 7 years like I did and say, you know, there's something a little different up here than down there, or, you know, look over here, and then there's fire and there's not fire, but really interesting geology.
Go ahead.
Well, I had a question. You were talking about the gully formation of 360 and the process of getting the kids to measure it, taking it to TxDOT, and then coming out here to find a solution.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing that question.
Sorry, you talked about the process of the gully formation from 360 and getting the kids to measure it and taking it to TxDOT and having them come out here. Do you think that would happen today?
Do I think what?
Do you think that you would get a responsiveness from TxDOT today to find a solution?
The answer is no.
TxDOT is a little bit more forward thinking than it was 50 years ago. Is that faint enough praise? I mean, they, you know, at that point, native plants were like, you know, they did put some money towards the native plant seed project down in South Texas, and then that project expanded, and that was half funded by Highway Department, because, you know, even if you're just hardly paying attention, you can see that really on a lot of these places, on these cuts and all that, native plants are going to can really help them with erosion, you know. And they don't need to put sanding on them on these types of slopes and all that. And, you know, then TxDOT, you know, has mixes that they have the one kind of mix which has mostly the little blue stem and the side oats and the gramagrass and blah, blah, blah. And you use that on these places. No, we don't really need that in the city. Well, because, you know, we don't need Indian grass prairies on the sides of I-35 when they build it again and all that. So, you know, they've grown a little bit. But, you know, they still will spec KR blue stem and things like that. So But people need to work on the next half, maybe. The whole invasive, spreading invasive seeds all over the place like crazy is just not my idea of enlightenment.
There, two folks, Bill and Nico, have both had involvement out here. Can each of y'all kind of throw in some geology and some botany and your thoughts on Wild Basin?
I'm a geologist, and so what you're saying about the windows on the road cut here. I just got to take the balcony inspection access out the Singular River, the same horizon you have here, which is a contact between the windows and the walnut. You get to see these dinosaur tracks that are this big. They're Apatosaurus, and we've seen them also on 1810 and 26. So I'm expecting that. I think I've seen signs on there in the road cut. Some of the dinosaur footprints is what we find right here. But I'm also going to add that a lot of the erosion, that the sedimentation of the north hollow of Bee Creek is not just from the TxDOT road cut, but it's been pretty well documented when the Davenports cleared the ranch, back before the 50s. There was massive erosion, perhaps a fire as well, So a lot of restoration they're doing on the Vireo Preserve across the way is trying to rebuild the soil back, which was totally gone. And I think people kind of accept that, well, it's just rocky slopes, they don't have soils. Well, no, they're actually, like William Gray noted in 1904, there's pretty good soil and massive loss that was documented. And one way it was documented is when Lake McDonald was here between 1892 to 1900 before the flood took it out. The reservoir was documented by Taylor at the University of Texas. All the way up around Commons Ford, there was massive sedimentation. Commons Ford that they documented nearly filling in. About 70% of the reservoir was filled within 8 years. And how does that affect our water supply even now? The water supply is the reservoir is getting filled in. You say, well, we have 40% water in there. Well, how much is that filled with sediment? It's one of the things. But then, so anyway, this was going to add that perspective as well. And Phil, you're going to add?
Well, that's for me. I honestly haven't done anything out here. I've been lucky enough that I've done a lot of good work all over Texas, but I really haven't done any work at Wild Basin. And I noticed that somebody was trying to credit me with planting that for Wild Basin. And if they read the fine print, they would see that it was actually, my job was just a compiler. So there's people like John Williams and Brother Daniel and David and
But you put the report together, didn't you?
The report? No, obviously not. I don't even know what you're talking about.
We have a report with your name on it here.
Maybe there are two little copies.
Unfortunately.
No, I'm not being disingenuous. I mean, I just haven't done it. So. But I'm not.
I know you well, and you're an awfully modest person. Let's put it that way. I would like to, if we can keep talking, I would like to say, make a geology comment.
Go for it.
Okay. When I arrived here in 2000, when I took the job as caretaker, I had almost zero knowledge of geology, despite the fact that I had a biology degree. And we had over the 10 years I was here, we had a series of geologists, very good people who helped us. Some academics, some were retired petroleum engineering geologists and so forth. But they were all really good, and they were teaching the staff and the volunteers, especially the trail guides, about the geology here. And it took me years to reach this determination, but when young people ask me about what they're going to study in terms of the natural sciences, I said, I don't care what your major is going to be. The first course you need to take is geology, basic geology, 2 semesters, because everything we have is floating around in space. on this ball, and it's all about geology. The forms, the types of soils, where the water is, et cetera, et cetera. And if you understand geology, you'll have a real advantage. I had to make that up in just a few years. Fortunately, I had terrific help from people like Phil Davis, and I can see the other two guys, but I can't remember their name. But I really believe that. And I regret not having taken geology when I was in college.
But then too is that there's one thing's rare around this area, you know, is the caves, which were kind of widespread filled, and some of them down the way, you know, City Westlake, Little Beach Creek, you know, there's some caves that were 100 foot diameter, you know, were filled in. They had the Creek Harvestman is only preserved in one cave in the mouth of in the whole world. That Harvestman is only protected in one cave. The mouth of Big Creek, we also have the Streptocanthus flower, you know, which is becoming increasingly rare, bracteosus flower, in Austin disappearing, you know, so it's a rare place, you know, to find. Now, just last year, we found Martin Sprigg salamander at the mouth of Big Creek, which, you know, was a new discovery. And with folks from St. Edwards, we're doing some acoustical game camera. A lot of the sightings from the neighbors of things like mountain lions and possibly even jaguarunes. We're trying to capture those on camera and acoustical. So that would be kind of, again, a really rare, interesting if they actually were present there.
What was it, Nico?
Mountain lion and jaguarune. Jaguarune is only known to be around the water, except it's been photographed in Ribbon Springs on a ranch. Some people saw it and they got game camera. So when people look, you tend to find things like the Martin Sprigg salamander.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of rare stuff on Bee Creek and Little Big Creek that brings to my mind that need to protect it. It's just unusually rare. It's the stuff you have here, and precious.
Well, friends, has it been a fun evening?
Yes.
All right.